16 people have reached the moon and never set foot on it. 12 got the footprints. These 16 got a window. One of them flew a lunar module to within 47,000 feet of the surface and was ordered to turn back. And the reason isn't the one you've heard. 10 missions have reached the moon in 57 years. I went through the crew list of every one. All 16 trained for a landing. One lost his seat 3 days before launch. It's easy to call them the unlucky ones. But the most famous name on this list was offered a mission of his own and said no. Every seat on every Apollo crew was decided by one man. Deke Slayton was one of the Mercury 7. A heart flutter grounded him before he ever flew, and he spent the next decade deciding which of his colleagues would go instead. To keep it fair, he built a rule. Back up a mission, and you fly as prime crew 3 flights later. Stafford, Young, and Cernan backed up Apollo 7, and 3 flights on they were the prime crew of Apollo 10. But the rule decided which mission you flew. It said nothing about which seat. And on a lunar mission, one of the 3 seats went nowhere. The command module pilot flew the mothership. While 2 men rode the lander down, he stayed in orbit alone, 60 miles up, minding the only vehicle that could get all 3 of them home. And if the lunar module failed to reach orbit on the way back up, he was the rescue. He wasn't a passenger, he was the ride home. 6 missions landed. 6 men flew the command module while their crewmates walked below them. Not one of them set foot on the surface. Not on that flight. Not on a later one. Not ever. There was exactly one way out of that seat. Come back as a commander. John Young managed it. He flew the command module on Apollo 10, then returned in command of Apollo 16. He walked. But Apollo 10 was never going to land. For the 6 who orbited alone while 2 crewmates stood on the ground beneath them, there was no second flight. That's the shape of this list. Some were in the wrong seat. Some were on the wrong mission. Some were 3 days from the wrong kind of luck. And the first 3 never had a chance at all. Because when they left for the moon, the machine that could land on it wasn't finished. In June of 1968, the Apollo 8 lunar module arrived at Cape Canaveral, and the engineers opened it up. What they found inside was bad enough that Grumman, the manufacturer, offered its own estimate. The first flight-ready lunar module wouldn't exist until February, at the earliest. There were 18 months left in the decade. On August 9th, George Low, who ran the Apollo Spacecraft Program Office, put an idea in front of management. If the lunar module wasn't ready but the command module was, why wait? Fly it without one. And not in Earth orbit. To the moon. On August 19th, NASA announced the lunar module was off Apollo 8, but said nothing about where the spacecraft was going. That decision wasn't made until November 12th, 6 weeks before launch. There was a reason for the hurry. That autumn, the Soviet probe Zond 6 looped around the moon uncrewed, and on the way back it depressurized and hit the Earth at a speed that would have killed anyone inside. The Soviets were one probe away from sending a man around the moon in a ship that had just killed an imaginary crew. So Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders flew to the moon in the ship they had, not the one they needed, with nothing to land in. Anders got the worst of the deal. He was a lunar module pilot with no lunar module. They'd taken his spacecraft away and handed him a camera. He was convinced his contribution would be negligible. On December 24, 1968, 75 hours and 48 minutes into the mission, the 4th of their 10 orbits began. Borman rolled the spacecraft, a routine attitude maneuver. But as it turned, the windows swung around, and over the gray horizon came the Earth. Anders shot it in black and white, the film he had loaded. Then he shouted for color. Lovell dug out a magazine and framed the shot from his own window. Anders pushed himself across and got 2 frames off before the Earth slid out of view. The man who thought he'd contribute nothing had just taken the most influential photograph of the space program. That night, the 3 of them broadcast live from lunar orbit. Lovell described what he was looking at. The vast loneliness, he said, is awe-inspiring, and it makes you realize what you've got back there. They ended by taking turns reading from Genesis. That was how 1968 ended. The year of the assassinations, the riots, of Tet. It ended with 3 men reading from another world. Borman never flew again. Anders left NASA, and Lovell, the only one of the 3 who'd go back, would return in a different seat with a problem nobody saw coming. But that's 2 years away. Before it happens, 2 men are going to take a working lunar module down to 9 miles above the surface and be ordered not to touch it. There's a story people tell about Apollo 10, and it's false. The popular version says NASA deliberately loaded the lunar module with less fuel than it needed. that they knew if those two were given the chance to set down on the moon, they'd take it. It's a great story, and it was kept alive by one of the two men inside. May 1969. Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan climb into the lunar module, call it Snoopy, and undock from the command module they've named Charlie Brown. John Young is left alone upstairs. The plan is to do everything Apollo 11 will do in 2 months' time. Except one thing. They light the descent engine. They go down. And at 47,400 feet above the Sea of Tranquility, about 9 miles, they stop going down. From there, they rehearsed every maneuver needed to land, except the final burn that would have put them on the ground. Stafford radioed that they were so close you could just drop the tailhook. They weren't. And here's the real reason. Snoopy carried 18,218 pounds of propellant in the descent stage. Plenty to land. The ascent stage carried 2,631, about half what later lunar modules would take. Enough for the orbital maneuvers on the flight plan, not enough to lift off the surface and come back. But that reduced load had nothing to do with preventing an unauthorized landing. It reflected how much propellant would be left after the liftoff the mission profile actually called for. Nobody designed a cage. They designed a rehearsal. The thing is, Cernan fed the legend for years. He'd say that a lot of people had thought about the kind of guys they were and decided not to give them the opportunity, because they just might take it. Out of his mouth it sounds like pride. Out of the numbers it's a myth. And that's why the story won't die. The real danger came afterward. Staging off the descent stage, the move that mimics liftoff from the surface, sent the lunar module tumbling. Stafford and Cernan caught it, and docked with Charlie Brown on the far side of the moon, out of contact with Earth. Coming out of the blackout, Stafford reported that Snoopy and Charlie Brown were hugging each other. And there's something to settle before we go on. 3 men reached the moon that day without landing, but 2 of them came back. John Young walked the surface in 1972 in command of Apollo 16. Gene Cernan did too, the same year, commanding Apollo 17, the last human being to stand there. Of the 3, only one never got his turn. Tom Stafford flew to 9 miles above the moon, turned around, and never went back. 6 years later, he'd command the American half of Apollo-Soyuz. The man who ran the dress rehearsal for the greatest triumph of the space race ended up closing it out by shaking the rival's hand. Stafford, at least, knew from the start that his mission didn't include landing. The next 5 didn't have that. They flew on missions that did land, listening on the radio to 2 crewmates working 60 miles beneath them. And they stayed inside. There's a moment these 5 men shared that nobody else has ever lived. The spacecraft passes behind the moon, the radio cuts out, and for about 40 minutes there's nobody. Not Houston, not the crewmates below, not another known form of life. Just one man, one ship, and the side of a world nobody sees. Orbit after orbit, while 2 friends picked up rocks 60 miles underneath him. Dick Gordon already knew what it was like to lose a fight with space. In 1966, on Gemini 11, he went outside to clip a tether between his spacecraft and a target vehicle. The task was planned for nearly 2 hours. 10 minutes in, he was finished. The effort of holding himself steady in weightlessness sent his heart rate through the roof, and sweat ran down his face until he lost the sight in his right eye. He rested for half an hour before his commander could haul him back through the hatch. Nobody had solved how to work outside a spacecraft yet. Gordon proved it with his own body. In November of 1969, he flew Yankee Clipper, while Pete Conrad and Alan Bean walked the Ocean of Storms. And he had one card left. He was going to command Apollo 18. Hold on to that. We'll come back to it. Stuart Roosa reached the moon with 500 passengers in his pocket. Before NASA, Roosa had been a smoke jumper, one of those firefighters who parachute into forest fires you can't drive to. Years later, the chief of the Forest Service remembered him and asked him to carry seeds. Roosa took a metal canister the size of a soda can up on Apollo 14 with hundreds of seeds from 5 species inside. While Alan Shepard was hitting a golf ball across the lunar surface, Roosa made 34 orbits of the moon with that canister in his personal kit. They germinated. And today there are full-grown trees standing outside courthouses, schools, and parks across America that have been in lunar orbit. There's usually no plaque. You can walk within 10 feet of one and never know. People asked him many times what the trip had done to him inside. His answer: space changes nobody. Al Worden did something only 3 people have ever done. In August of 1971, coming home from Apollo 15, he opened the command module hatch in the middle of the void between the Earth and the Moon and climbed out to retrieve the film canisters from the cameras mounted on the outside. The whole cabin had to be depressurized. His crewmates waited inside in their suits while he worked his way hand over hand along the hull. He was more than 200,000 miles from home, and he could see the moon and the Earth at the same time. From the Earth you can't. From the moon you can't either. He spent 6 days in lunar orbit, 3 of them completely alone. And then he lost everything over some envelopes. The Apollo 15 crew carried about 400 unauthorized postal covers to the moon. A West German stamp dealer named Hermann Seeger had paid each of them $7,000 on the understanding that nothing would be sold until the Apollo program was over. Seeger didn't wait. When Slayton found out, he pulled them off the Apollo 17 backup crew. They'd already given the money back. It didn't matter. None of the 3 ever flew again. Worden was the first human being to walk in deep space. His career ended over $7,000 and a stack of envelopes. Ken Mattingly lost his seat to a 3-year-old he'd never met. 3 weeks before Apollo 13 launched, Charlie Duke, from the backup crew, spent time with friends. Their son's 3-year-old playmate came down with rubella the following week. Duke hadn't had it as a child, so he caught it, and kept training with the other 5 crewmen while he was contagious. At the pre-flight physical, the flight surgeon drew blood from everyone. Lovell had immunity. Heisey had immunity. Mattingly didn't. They pulled him off the mission. NASA couldn't risk the only man aboard the command module falling ill with his crewmates on the surface. Mattingly never came down with rubella. 2 years later, he flew as command module pilot on Apollo 16, and on that crew was Charlie Duke, who went down and walked. The man who had cost him Apollo 13 stood on the moon in front of him. Mattingly never did. He'd go on to command 2 shuttle missions. Ron Evans was the last one. December 1972, Apollo 17. While Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt worked in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, Evans logged 147 hours in lunar orbit. Nobody has spent longer up there. On the way home, he did what Worden had done. Went out into the void after the film. 30 feet back along the outside of the spacecraft, and 30 feet forward again. Evans had the time of his life. Sticking his head out into the vacuum, he let out a hot diggity dog and waved at the camera. It was the last deep space walk any human being has made, and Evans is still the last person to orbit the moon alone. He died of a heart attack in 1990, at 56. The only one of these men who left too early to tell his own version. 5 men, 5 missions, the same chair. All of them listened on the radio while their crewmates described ground they weren't going to touch. But at least their crewmates got down there. 2 years earlier, another crew made the trip knowing 2 of them were going to walk. They trained the descent, they had the site picked. And 125,000 miles from Earth, something exploded. Jim Lovell is the only man who went to the moon twice and never set foot on it. The first time was Apollo 8, in the ship with no lunar module. The second time there was one. It was called Aquarius, it worked, and it had a spot reserved in the Fra Mauro Highlands. Lovell and Fred Hayes were going down on April 15, 1970, to spend 33 hours exploring. They'd trained the descent for 8 months. Jack Swigert had been on the crew for 3 days. He was the backup pilot. When the blood test grounded Mattingly, Swigert went from the bench to the center seat of a lunar mission with less than 72 hours' notice. They launched on April 11th. 2 days later, 200,000 miles from Earth, an oxygen tank in the service module blew. What happened next has been told many times. What gets told less is what it cost the bodies inside. The lunar module was built to keep 2 men alive for 48 hours. It had to keep 3 alive for nearly 90. To stretch the power, they shut down everything they could spare. Heaters, lights, even the guidance computer. The temperature dropped to around 50 degrees, and into the 40s in the darkened command module. Moisture condensed on the panels. The water lines froze. They barely ate. They slept less. Heisey carried a kidney infection the whole way home. By splashdown on April 17th, Lovell had lost 14 pounds, and on the way, they set a record. Swinging around the moon on a trajectory nobody had designed, they reached 248,655 miles from Earth. Nobody had ever been that far from home. That record stood for 56 years, and whoever took it very recently. We'll come back to that. None of the 3 ever flew again. Lovell retired in 1973. He was the first human being to fly 4 times, twice of them to the moon. He never stood on another world. He died on August 7, 2025, at 97. Fred Heise was going to command Apollo 19. We'll leave that there. And Jack Swigert is the one that hurts most on this list. The man who joined a lunar mission on 3 days' notice and survived the vacuum in a broken ship, left NASA and went into politics. In 1982, he won a seat in Congress for Colorado. During the campaign, he was diagnosed with cancer. He died that December, at 51, without ever being sworn in. He survived deep space. He didn't survive the waiting room. Fred Haise is still alive. He's the last surviving member of that crew, and the last of everyone who reached the moon on Apollo without being able to land. But Heise had a second ticket. He had it in writing, and in an office in Washington, somebody was doing the math. On January 4, 1970, less than 6 months after the first human footprints on the moon, NASA canceled Apollo 20. It wasn't fear, it was inventory. Every Saturn V was committed, and one was needed to launch Skylab. Somebody had to lose a rocket. 8 months later came the real cut. On September 2, 1970, NASA canceled Apollo 18 and Apollo 19. And here's the detail that makes it more than a budget footnote. The spacecraft were already built. There were 2 complete vehicles, paid for and nearly flight-ready. What there wasn't was money to launch them. It could have been worse. Nixon went after Apollo 16 and 17 as well, and it was his deputy budget director, Caspar Weinberger, who talked him out of it. Officially, no crews were ever assigned to the canceled missions, but Slayton's rule tells you who was going, and the backup crews were already training. Apollo 18 belonged to Dick Gordon as commander, with Vance Brand and Harrison Schmitt. Apollo 19 to Fred Haise, with William Pogue and Gerald Carr. 2 men on this list had a second ticket in hand. Both lost it the same day, neither for anything they did wrong. Schmitt got out. He was a geologist, the only professional scientist in the astronaut corps, and the pressure to get one down there before it all ended was too strong. They moved him to Apollo 17, the only scientist who has ever stood on the moon. Gordon stayed on the ground. He'd survived a spacewalk that nearly blinded him in one eye, he'd orbited the moon alone, and his one chance to go down disappeared in a budget document. He never complained. He said he had a job to do. Years later, Alan Bean, his lunar module pilot on Apollo 12, who became a painter after he retired, painted that mission. He called it the Fantasy. All 3 of them are standing on the lunar surface. Heise never got back to the moon either, but he did fly again. In 1977, he flew the Shuttle Enterprise on the approach and landing tests. 5 flights dropping a spacecraft off the back of a Boeing 747 to see whether it would glide. The man who was a day away from walking Fra Mauro ended up teaching the program that replaced his How to Fly. Of the leftover Saturn Vs, 1 launched Skylab. The other 2 are still lying on their sides at the Kennedy Space Center and in Houston. Complete moon rockets, horizontal, that never lit an engine. Every man we've talked about so far lost the moon to something outside himself. A late lunar module, a mission profile, a seat, a virus, a budget cut, all but one. There was a man on this list who was offered command of his own landing mission, with the moon waiting and the blessing of the man who handed out the seats. He said no. On July 20th, 1969, while 2 men took the first human steps on another world, the third was alone in a spacecraft 60 miles up and saw none of it. There was no television on board. Houston mentioned it over the radio. He was probably the only person around without coverage. Collins said he didn't mind a bit. He was alone for almost 28 hours. Every orbit, the spacecraft passed behind the moon, and the radio cut out. There were no satellites to relay him from that side. For those minutes, Collins was the first human being completely alone on the far side of a world. He described it himself. He was alone, truly alone, and absolutely isolated from any known life. But his job wasn't to be there. His job was to be ready. If the lunar module lifted off and failed to reach the altitude it needed, Collins had to drop into a lower orbit and try to catch it. That was the good contingency. The other one was the one nobody put in writing. If the ascent engine failed with Armstrong and Aldrin still on the surface, there was no rescue. Nobody could go down for them. Collins would have to light the engine, leave lunar orbit, and come home alone. It was a real fear, and it was in the flight planning, and he knew it when he launched. All 3 came back. Eagle lifted off, the docking went clean, and they splashed down in the Pacific on July 24th. Here's where Collins' story stops looking like the others. Before the launch, Deke Slayton had made him a promise. As soon as Apollo 11 was home, he'd put him back in the flight rotation to command a mission of his own. His turn to go down. His boots in the dust. Collins turned it down. He didn't lose it to a virus, or a budget cut, or a blood test. He was offered command of a lunar mission and decided he didn't want it. He never presented it as a sacrifice. He compared the job to running base camp on a mountain expedition. Somebody has to stay below so the ones going up can come down. And he reckoned he'd already done that job. He left NASA in 1970 and ended up running the National Air and Space Museum. He spent the rest of his life answering the same question, whether it hurt not to have walked, and answering it the same way every time. He died in 2021, at 90. He designed the mission patch, an eagle settling onto the moon with an olive branch in its talons, no names, no initials, so that the patch would stand for everyone who worked on the program, not the 3 men in the spacecraft. The man history remembers for what he didn't do, designed the symbol that erased his own name. For 53 years that list was closed. 12 men had walked on the moon. 12 had reached it and come home without touching it. The numbers matched. Nobody was going to add another. Until 4 months ago. On April 1, 2026, a rocket lifted off from Pad 39B at Cape Canaveral with 4 people aboard. Reed Wiseman in command, Victor Glover as pilot, Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen as mission specialists. 10 days around the moon and back. Artemis 2, the first time a human being had left Earth orbit since December of 1972. They had no lander. And the reason should sound familiar, because it's the same one from 1968. The vehicle that has to go down isn't ready. The landers are being built by SpaceX and Blue Origin, and they have to be tested in Earth orbit first. That's Artemis 3, in 2027. The crewed landing is Artemis 4, in 2028. 58 years on, the villain hasn't changed its name. These 4 made the same trip Borman, Lovell, and Anders made. They got there, went around, and came home. Christina Koch became the first woman to travel around the moon. Victor Glover, the first black astronaut sent on a lunar mission. Jeremy Hansen, the first Canadian. Going around the far side, they lost contact with Earth for about 40 minutes. The same silence Collins knew by heart, with one difference: there were 4 of them. And somewhere on that pass, the crew made a request. Reed Wiseman's wife was called Carol. She died of cancer in 2020, at 46, leaving him a widower with 2 daughters. As they came around the moon, the 4 of them asked that a crater be named for her, one right on the boundary between the near side and the far side, the kind you can sometimes see from Earth. Hansen put it to mission control like this: "It's a bright spot on the moon, and we'd like to call it Carol." Then, on the way home, they broke a record. At its furthest point, Artemis 2 reached 252,756 miles from Earth. The previous mark belonged to Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Heise, set in April of 1970. It had stood for 56 years. Lovell never saw it fall. He'd died 8 months earlier. Swigert had been dead 43 years. Fred Heise saw it. He's alive, at 92. In April, the man who came within a day of walking Fra Mauro watched 4 people take away the record he'd set inside a ship that was broken, freezing, and dark. In June, NASA named the Artemis 3 crew. None of the 4 from Artemis 2 is on it. Koch had been asked before launch whether it frustrated her to reach the moon without going down. She said she'd be thrilled to see someone she knows assigned to walk up there, and that if it isn't in her space destiny to do it, that's just fine with her. It is, word for word, the same answer Rusa gave, and Gordon, and Collins. 28 people have reached the moon. 16 came home without standing on it. But there's a larger group almost nobody talks about. The men who trained for years to go, with a mission assigned and a landing site picked, and who never left the ground. Some of them gave a decade to Apollo without ever leaving the atmosphere. We know their names. We know which mission was theirs and what they were going to do up there. That story is in the next video.